Welcome back to part 2 of ADND, where today's topic is the diesel fuel shortage. ADND is the attention deficit news disorder segments on Common Sense for Uncommon Times, where we cover important topics that are often ignored by those who are in the media. One of the last things mentioned at the conclusion of the previous segment before I broke is how Biden is not only ignoring this crisis that he helped create, but he's offering a different version of history than reality. If you missed the first part, you should be able to find it at Common Sense for Uncommon Times on the platform where you found this video. Because we only have a few weeks remaining of diesel fuel supply in the United States, if action isn't taken quickly, it could have a devastating consequence on the entire country. It baffles me how few people understand the gravity of this potential looming man-made crisis. It reminds me of the calm before the storm of COVID, but we've got a pretty good warning here. Again, I pray that common sense-minded people will help rectify this situation before it's too late. But who? Well, you and I need to raise awareness and tell our legislators to stop the insanity that created this deficit. And we need to send a strong message on November 8th that enough is enough. All appearances indicate that President Biden or his surrogates and current leaders in Congress are playing Russian roulette with our entire economy in order to maintain an ideological control of power. The economic impact of green initiatives are squeezing everyone's budget through higher energy costs, groceries, and durable goods. Reports indicate that all the green initiatives in the world have had an inconsequential impact on climate. Isn't that a surprise? For America, China, and the rest of the world, on average, 95% of our energy resources do not come from wind or solar, but rather nuclear power and fossil fuels like oil, gas, coal, and so on. Now, if you look at the top 50 countries who depend on fossil fuels the most by percentage, the United States doesn't even make the list. Still, we do not have the infrastructure to switch to solar and wind power, which are unreliable resources at this point. The most ironic illustration of how out of whack our energy agenda is came to light when Californians were asked not to charge their electric cars during the heat of summer because the grid couldn't handle the load. This came days after Newsom announced gas-powered new car sales would be outlawed in 13 years. Environmental activists, President Biden, and leaders in Congress are taking away our energy options with an unrealistic expectation that the U.S. can somehow shoulder the burden of reducing our carbon footprint enough to save the entire world, while other nations like China are increasing their carbon footprint exponentially. With no sufficient replacement energy source, if environmental leftists are permitted to pursue this aggressive agenda, their irrational thinking could turn out the lights in America. Meanwhile, China is dead set on conquering us and our economy while they continue using fossil fuels all along the way. And in case you didn't know, some of China's current oil supply came from our strategic oil reserves released this past year by Biden. And now, their oil reserves are at an all-time high, while ours are at the lowest since 1984. And it makes me wonder what George Orwell might say about that. Like false prophets who claim to know the date and hour of Christ's return, some activists cite questionable science and prophesy that we will destroy the environment and the world by 2035 or sooner. Maybe, just maybe, you'll find some comfort in knowing that since the 1970s, similar activists have made similar claims nonstop. And last year, the New York Post published an article highlighting 50 of those prophecies. Fortunately for us, every time the prediction of our demise without activist intervention has been found to be vastly overstated. Much of this oil and diesel crisis should be placed squarely on the backs of politicians and bureaucrats who are developing bad policies. Some others who should share in the blame include new energy business companies who are lobbying for massive change while making billions of dollars all along the way, much of it from government contracts. My goal from this AD&D episode is not to strike fear, but action. Again, November 8th is just around the corner. We have clearly witnessed what happens when the scales of power tip in favor of historical revisionists who want to drag us into a planned economy where those in power control and regulate most everything. That is a form of statism, and I liken it to a gateway drug of all the other isms. Every time in history, When Marxist, socialist, and communist regimes rose in power with the promise of solving everyone's problems, they instead created more problems and more oppression. Ultimately, those who believed the most and hoped the most in the false promises of fairness and equity became tragic victims of the deception. The energy policies of our president and other politicians are putting our economy and national security at risk. If you thought the COVID crackdowns and shutdowns were devastating, failure to remedy this problem will make the last few years seem like a holiday. With the economy tanking, the Biden bribe began trying to buy votes for the midterm. Democrats complain about Republicans spending a lot of private money on the elections. Meanwhile, they're spending a lot of private money and using public resources and other people's money, that's yours and mine, to persuade voter loyalty to keep supporting them and their expensive failed policies. The student loan bailout and depletion of the oil reserves are just a couple of ways they've done this. Okay, I know I need to wrap this up. This is a political crisis caused by political idiocracy. If we fail to act soon and remedy this diesel fuel situation just days after the midterm election, the current high prices due to inflation for gas, groceries, and everything that we need to sustain ourselves could escalate like Argentina in the 1980s. Now, my wife and her family, they lived there during that time, and they know firsthand how devastating it was. Inflation is bad. Hyperinflation is so much worse. We need common sense measures now. Throughout the scriptures, we read cautions against moving boundary stones. There's Proverbs 22:28 and 23:11. And in many other places, we can see similar passages. Usually, it's talking about encroaching on land that isn't yours. In other situations, it's about setting parameters for how we're supposed to live. There are other occasions where we are encouraged to ask why a boundary stone is where it is. Newton's third law of motion says, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. There's an important lesson we can take from Newton and from the scriptures that are talking about boundary stones. More Americans should have asked why the strategic oil reserve existed before Biden used it for political gain. We should have also insisted that he consider the consequences of depleting those reserves and cutting off our own supply when no other energy source was prepared to carry the load. Our president pillaged the reserves, undercut the free markets, and either ignored implications this would have on our transportation industry and economy, or he intentionally accelerated America towards a further crisis. And then he determined to bribe voters with public resources and hoped that they would overlook his irresponsible transgressions. Another president has been impeached for a whole lot less than this. It's very possible we will all recognize too late a crisis created right under our noses because we were too distracted by other things. Well, this here has been another episode of Attention Deficit News Disorder on Common Sense for Uncommon Times. Have a great day.